Good evening, y'all. My name is Cale Carter, and today we're going to conclude our short series of videos on the 364th Infantry by focusing on the investigations that occurred after the Camp Van Dorn incidences. Now, to go ahead and get started, in the aftermath of the Camp Van Dorn incidences, the U.S. Army launched a total of 3 investigations into the 364th Infantry. The first one was led by the War Department, and that one was led by a Colonel Joel Birney, who ironically served as an assistant to Benjamin O. Davis Sr.'s investigation into the 364th in the Phoenix Massacre. The second one was launched by the Third Army, and with the terms of the Third Army was the parent organization of the 364th while they were stateside. And the last investigation was basically launched and led by the officers at Camp Van Dorn. Now, the overall core goals of those investigations was to, 1, identify the core causes of what led to those events that occurred at Camp Van Dorn, and 2, determine who was at fault. Was it ringleaders amongst the enlisted black soldiers? Was it basically the commanding officer at fault? And if so, should he be removed? So the overall core goals was try to identify the core causes and ultimately find who was at fault and punish him. Now, the interesting thing about the U.S. Army investigation into the 364th following the Camp Van Dorn incidences was that all the investigations relied, or at least partly relied, on information that was generated by agents of the Counterintelligence Corps who infiltrated the ranks of the 364th Infantry Regiment. Now, for those who may be watching, y'all may be wondering, well, what is the Counterintelligence Corps? Now, the Counterintelligence Corps was a branch of the U.S. Army that existed during World War II, and their core goal was to try to, in essence, help find out who was spying on behalf of the Axis forces, as well as try to basically keep tabs on spies, root out people who were supplying information, both primarily within the Army ranks to like our adversaries. Now, that was their official goal. Now, if you was to look at the average black soldier who may have known about the Counterintelligence Corps, they might have had a different picture of the Counterintelligence Corps, because during the war, when black units usually heard of the Counterintelligence Corps, the Counterintelligence Corps, with regards to the black units, came off as an organization that was there to try to stamp out, quote, troublemakers, unquote. And by troublemakers, that referred to people who were within black units who might have been labeled as troublemakers. People who might have said, okay, well, yeah, we shouldn't be taking this type of racism. We should do something to prove a point. Or like, and it might even go to the extreme. There may be soldiers within the ranks who say, hey, we should conduct a sit-down protest to try to improve our conditions. So the Counterintelligence Corps on paper was supposed to be designed to address these, like, basically issues involving spies and stuff like that, and even in some cases address things that may negatively impact morale within the soldiers. But within black units, the Counterintelligence Corps came off as an organization that would kind of stamp out any type of progress or stamp out any type of advocacy that may generate within the ranks, depending on who you talk to. Now, the one thing I did find interesting, and this is the last thing I'll cover regarding the Counterintelligence Corps, was that among the organizations that helped kind of train the Counterintelligence Corps, one of those organizations was the FBI. So, but I digress. So, the Counterintelligence Corps sent agents to infiltrate the 364th Infantry. And one of the first agents to infiltrate the 364th Infantry was a man named George Kennedy. Now, George Kennedy as an agent was well regarded by the Counterintelligence Corps, and he was considered a very experienced soldier. And initially, when his initial report on the 364th came out, it was pretty much passed around at a very rapid rate, both at the War Department and other levels that was in the investigation. Now, his initial take on the 364th was that the 364th was a group of undisciplined delinquents, and that trouble will spring up spontaneously at the slightest provocation where any group of the 364th was gathered. Now, the interesting thing about that, it pretty much painted the 364th as an unruly mob. And initially, when that report came out, it was passed around like wildfire. Now, the grand irony about that report was that ultimately other agents who came up behind him actually ended up dismissing most of that report. And by dismissing it, basically noticing stuff like this. They said that, okay, well, with regards to Kennedy's report, while his reports did have a grain of truth to them, overall they seemed to be overly exaggerated regarding the mentality and the understanding of these black soldiers. And the irony, though, is that while the later reports ultimately go on to state that while yes, the black soldiers did participate in these actions, however, this seems to be more so an issue that is kind of isolated to individuals rather than an entire unit. The reports like George Kennedy, as well as the other negative reports that come out from the other negative attributes that come from the reports of the agents of the Counterintelligence Corps, go on to play a role in the ultimate fate of the 364th, which I'll explain a little bit later. Now, another interesting element about this investigation is that while the investigation was focusing on the 364th Infantry Regiment at Camp Van Dorn, the U.S. Army was going through an entire series of events at various bases throughout the summer of 1943 involving clashes between black soldiers, white MPs, and white locals. And some of these clashes occurred in Georgia, they occurred in Louisiana, and they even occurred in North Carolina. And the irony is that in terms of the events that occurred at Camp Van Dorn, in terms of carnage and number of deaths, the incidences at Camp Van Dorn were relatively tame in comparison to the other incidents that occurred throughout the country. But with all that being stated, in some circles of the U.S. Army, particularly the War Department and some of the other areas, they view the issues with the 364th as primarily an officer's issue. And in fact, George C. Marshall, he actually issued out a memorandum to pretty much all the commanders of black units, basically stating that that at the end of the day, those white officers who was in charge of those black units were responsible for anything that those soldiers did, and that therefore because they were responsible, it was up to them to take preventative steps by finding out what is generating these causes of these incidences, and ultimately taking steps to do preventative maintenance to prevent those things from becoming an issue. So ultimately, while some of the officers they see it more so as an officer's problem, some of the investigations from the 3rd Army and some from Camp Van Dorn, they feel it's more so the black soldiers' problem. And some go as far as to say, well, we may need to just go ahead, disband this unit, or convert this unit into another, basically a service and supply unit, because this unit is too dangerous. The interesting element of that too is that between the investigations and the memorandum that was launched by the War Department, at this time they were still deciding on what would ultimately happen to the 364th. as I mentioned back in the very first video covering the 364th, the initial idea was that the 364th was supposed to be deployed to Europe. They were supposed to be deployed over to Europe, and going, really their reason for being in Camp Van Dorn in the first place was to receive more adequate training to deploy overseas. But with the incidences that occurred at Camp Van Dorn, and this being the second major investigation into the unit, the Army ground forces who oversaw the combat units of the U.S. Army, as well as the War Department, they started losing faith in the 364. They said, okay, well, if the 364th is having issues in Phoenix, and now they're having issues in Phoenix, they're having issues at Camp Van Dorn, we don't want to take that chance and deploy them overseas so they can continue doing similar events. And within the command, the idea is that, well, we have to deploy them overseas, because if we don't deploy them overseas, the black newspapers, the black advocacy groups are going to say, okay, well, y'all are complaining about the lack of manpower, and we got a black unit here, why are you not deploying them? But at the same time, they didn't want to deploy them to an active combat zone. Like, so this is the summer of 43 going on the fall. Summer going on the fall of 43. The combat zone would have been basically Italy, and then, or possibly even sending them to England for staging for the ultimate invasion of Europe. There was concern that, okay, well, if we send this unit that's been having problems to an overseas zone, it may get worse. So ultimately, the solution that comes about is that we're going to go ahead and deploy them, but we're going to deploy them to an area where we know, we're going to deploy them to an area that's considered an active combat zone, but an area that we know isn't going to face any major resistance. And ultimately, that area becomes the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Now, ultimately, with the investigations primarily place more so of the blame on the officers, although there was mention in some of the records that some soldiers were basically discharged later or basically court-martialed for various incidences. But they, of course, up to this point, I haven't found any direct records to say, okay, these people were court-martialed because of these incidences. So, with all that, this pretty much concludes the story of the 364th in World War II. The sad part is that, as I mentioned in the very first video, is that ultimately what happens when the 364th deploys to Alaska, their morale increases. Even though they're stuck at an isolated garrison, they ultimately go on to prove to be good soldiers. And in fact, while this investigation goes on, they're sent to Louisiana to participate in Louisiana maneuvers. And while they're there, they prove to be really good, at least adequate or even really good soldiers in their capacity. So with the 364th was their reputation because of them being delinquents, or was it because of them being delinquents, or was it because they weren't given a chance? And from the records I've read and from what I studied, it's more so a combination of these black soldiers being deployed to the Jim Crow South, having to deal with the systemic racism that comes with it, both systemic racism within the Army and systemic racism outside of it, and in addition to that, not really getting a chance to prove their worth. Because ultimately, going back to the aftermath of the Phoenix Massacre, and even the aftermath of this event, the soldiers pretty much wanted to prove them, so they wanted to prove that they were just as good as any other soldier. But of course, they had to deal with the issues that came with systemic racism and everything. But that pretty much wraps up the 364th Infantry. The next video that's going to be coming out is actually going to be focused on, it's going to actually move to another unit. We're going to actually start on the 365th Infantry Regiment, which actually has a pretty interesting history and is probably one of the more unique regiments of the black infantry regiments in World War II, for a reason that I will cover in that video. But I want to take time to thank y'all for watching this video. If y'all have any questions, just please comment below. Just take time to like and subscribe and just share this. But otherwise, I want to thank y'all for watching, and I hope y'all have a good night.